everybody, my name is Jasmine Jones, and I want you to think about this idea or this one question. When is it okay to hurt one singular group of people? When is it okay to inflict emotional or physical pain on one group of people? And if you can think of an example, does that example or does that situation benefit another group of people? This question and this thought process is the foundation of my speech. And so my speech will explain the U.S. government's exploitation of vulnerable groups of people to further their goals for America. And what I'm hoping to express to you is that the government has helped able-bodied, cisgender, mentally healthy, middle-class, straight, white people. It has helped them at the expense of the poor, the mentally ill, the lower class, people with disabilities, people of color. Yeah. So the government has helped these, what they thought to be the best type of person, at the expense of everyone else. 3 examples I have to support my claim are: the first is the story of Henrietta Lacks. She was a Black woman from Baltimore, Maryland, that had something stolen from her by a doctor at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Mind you, Johns Hopkins Hospital was one of the only hospitals that provided medical care to Black people in the 50s. My second example is the sterilization of people deemed feeble-minded by the government. My third example is that of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which took place between 1932 to 1972, 40 years, and it had over 600 participants who were all poor African American sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama. And I think that these 3 pieces of evidence will show how the government has taken advantage of these vulnerable groups of people. And so, talking about Henrietta Lacks, like I said, she was someone who went into a hospital seeking treatment, and it turns out that the doctor that she had seen, who was Dr. George Gay, had taken some of her cells out while she went in for bleeding. They had taken some of her cells out without her consent. And it turns out that was the standard procedure for the time. People would go in for treatment of tumors and similar issues, and they would come out having had cells removed. And it was fully without their knowledge or permission. It was just something that was done. And in most cases, it didn't have any effect, but it turns out her cells were different and they were immortal. So they just continued to grow and develop, and they can be used for a whole bunch of different purposes. And her cells are still being used until this day for the development of vaccinations, for cancer research, to find the effects of certain treatments, for the effects of hormones. Okay, my second piece of evidence was the sterilization. Carrie Buck and her mother and her daughter all had to be sterilized. This was decided by the courts because it was believed at the time that feeble-mindedness ran for 3 generations. It's like her mom had it, that means she had it, that means her daughter would have it. And so they all had to be sterilized so that they could not reproduce any further. And this was because it was thought at the time that people of mental illness were not what America needed, that they needed people who were considered mentally healthy. My third example is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And it was when Black men from a very poor town were gathered, and one group was selected because they had syphilis, and another group was selected because they didn't. And an issue with this study was that when the government decided that penicillin was a viable treatment for syphilis, the participants were not given that treatment. They were continued to be studied and watched or monitored despite having a treatment that could have potentially saved their lives. And so those three pieces of evidence go to show you that the government doesn't take that great of care of its people. The government has used certain vulnerable groups, people of color, people with disabilities, people with mental illness, and they use that to benefit other people, mainly white people, able-bodied people, mentally healthy people, middle class, upper class people. And I want to leave you with two things. One, I want to leave you with this phrase: America works hard to hide some people and to uplift others. And lastly, think about how can they fix the problems they've created? How can they somehow repay Henrietta Lacks? How can they repay the descendants of the Black men who were in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment? Can they even do that? Once again, my name is Jasmine Jones, and I want to thank you for listening.